Intel's Rocket Lake launch came in for a bit of flack. The Core i9-11900K sees core count drop from 10 to 8 versus 10900K, still a 14 nanometer part, and therefore there's the perception it's a high power processor that requires top-end cooling. Meanwhile, Ryzen has the cores and has the process advantage, and it's all on an obviously more expandable platform. Now, I'd say that all of this is true. Intel still has issues, but if your focus is on gaming and if you're looking for a price to performance bargain, it's really difficult to ignore the Core i5-11400F. It's a 6-core, 12-thread part, costs around £150 or $175, and guess what? It's actually available. You can buy it, and it's available at MSRP no less. Not only that, it's incredible value and performs beautifully for gaming. And you don't need a high-end motherboard to get the most out of the chip, nor do you need high-end cooling. So what do you need to know about the 11400F? Well, it's basically identical to the 11600K, the only difference being that overclocking, whether manual or automatic via the motherboard, is more limited. It's also using the new Cypress Cove architecture, meaning an IPC advantage that can present some interesting gen-on-gen boosts. But what's more interesting is the extent to which gains from overclocking the CPU can be somewhat limited. There's more to gain through pairing the chip with faster RAM. And that's where we've seen Intel finally wake up and smell the coffee. It's finally allowing faster memory kits to work with locked chips. Not only that, you don't need a Z board to achieve this anymore. All of the results you're about to see came from an MSI MAG B560M water Wi-Fi board. It's not cheap at £150 or $175, but these crucial features are available to all mid-range boards. For our tests, we've paired the 11400F with G.Skill Trident Royal Memory, 3600 MHz CL16. And really for this chip, I do recommend fast memory ahead of a high-end motherboard or top-of-the-range cooling. Before we go on though, a quick word about memory. So, locked 11th gen core in theory shouldn't support memory speeds over 2933 MHz. There's also Gear 1 and Gear 2 settings, with Gear 1 providing an optimal 1-to-1 ratio between memory and memory controller. Now out of the box you'd expect Gear 2 support only at speeds over 2933 MHz, but that's not the case here. When we engage XMP profile on the MSI board, we were at full speed and on Gear 1 spec. So essentially the good news here for gamers is that motherboard manufacturers are essentially ignoring most of Intel's spec limitations, and Intel itself doesn't seem to care. Indeed, it was Intel that supplied this MSI board and the chip to us for testing. The 11400F is a 65-watt chip, but the MSI board can also totally ignore this limitation. Within the BIOS, the CPU cooler option allows you to run flat out at 255 watts max, which does require high-end cooling. It's a nice feature to have, and yes, for the majority of this review we've benched with the 255 watt limit active and with Gear 1 memory and full XMP 3600 MHz. But look, there's a strong argument here that you don't need to, and that for gaming at least, even the laughably flimsy stock cooler may do just fine. You can look at Will Judd's excellent Digital Foundry at Eurogamer review for encoding and synthetic benchmarks, but the bottom line is that investing in top-end cooling and going for broke on power only gives you about 10 to 20% of extra performance. Meanwhile, the gains to gaming at 255 watt max, virtually non-existent. And that's where we begin our benchmarks to establish what the difference in performance is in gaming between the two power modes. So yeah, that's 255 watts max versus 65 watts max. And yet, it's a bit of a non-event really. In our tests, there were basically no variations in performance, none. The two modes operated identically. Here we're looking at Ashes of the Singularity in its CPU test mode, which saturates all cores. There's next to no difference. Next up, Far Cry 5, which relies on single-thread power primarily, and it doesn't really utilize the full processor. Still, once again, there's no difference, aside from a little blip here. We're using a 2080 Ti as the GPU here, and at 1080p any CPU could introduce some per run stutter. Crysis 3, this one will use all of the cores you throw at it, but it will not max them. Again, there are no perceivable differences whatsoever. So how about an esports champ, CSGO? No difference at all. So yeah, pretty straightforward, right? But it is kind of strange. Well, gaming workloads are very different from synthetic benchmarks. Games don't work the CPU as hard. Now, Rocket Lake has a reputation for running hot, but this generally tends to be when you're using AVX instructions, and those don't really tend to be used in gaming much, if at all. Memory bandwidth though, that's a different kettle of fish. My recommendation would be to funnel money away from a high-end motherboard or high-end cooling and sink it into decent memory instead. So here we're running Ashes of the Singularity at 2933 MHz RAM at 255 watts, up against the same chip limited to 65 watts, but paired with 3600 MHz memory. And essentially, faster RAM outpoints more power by 15%. The gap will vary according to game and indeed content within that game. So here in Far Cry 5, the same spec difference results in an 8% lead for the faster memory. Crysis 3, well, sometimes game content isn't memory bandwidth limited, and you get the same result. So let's recap then. The Core i5-11400F is basically like an 11600K, but with no core overclock and slower clocks. Oh, and the F designation means it has no onboard iGPU either. But thanks to Intel providing memory overclocking features on non-Z boards, we can finally extract full performance from locked CPUs. And as you shall discover, the results from this budget-orientated CPU are exceptional. Let's go back to Far Cry 5 as an example of a game reliant on single-core power primarily. Here we're stacking up the chip to the same spec as our existing data for higher-end i5 and Ryzen 5 parts. All of these chips are a lot more expensive than the 11400F, and yet the budget processor is holding its own against the 11600K and outperforming 10600K, and yeah, in many titles, even outperforming Ryzen 5 5600X. I'll refer you to the percentage differentials in the Eurogamer review linked in the video description, but I'm not going to dwell too much on them here. So take a look at this part of the Far Cry 5 benchmark. You have the 11th gen i5s at the top of the pile with 10th gen and Ryzen beneath. The FPS differentials are marked, but frame times are just a couple of milliseconds apart. I think if you had an adaptive refresh rate display, you'd struggle to tell the difference. If you're on a 144Hz screen with VSync on, well, you'd get a bit less stutter on 11th gen. That's the real life difference, if you like. I guess percentage differentials in the moment per our graphing here does give you an idea of how slight the variance is, and remember this is at 1080p with a 2080 Ti. A lopsided setup that basically forces you to be CPU limited. Our 11400F here can cut it against a 10900K, while you need to look at 11900K to give any kind of meaningful step up. A quick look at Crysis 3 next, an example of a multi-core aware game that thrives on both frequency and core clocks. 11400F loses just a little ground to the 11600K and mirrors 10600K performance quite closely. However, this title is Ryzen friendly and it's always ahead, about 10% faster overall, but again, look at the frame time graph in there. Dips lower measured within a couple of millisecond difference. Looking at percentage differentials against the high-end chips here, you can see that money does buy you meaningfully extra performance, but certainly not in line with the extra money you need to pay. However, if you have a super heavy workload and frame rates are relatively low, those percentage differentials become more meaningful to an actual gameplay experience. So allow me to demonstrate here with the Ashes of the Singularity CPU benchmark, which is based on gameplay, albeit with units that cannot be destroyed, to keep the stress level high. The percentage differentials show clear advantages over 10600K, but lower than 11600K, but frame rate difference would be very noticeable here, I think. Even more so when you factor in the higher end chips. But remember, again, every chip we're testing against the 11400F here is significantly more expensive. So I wanted to keep this review brief and to the point. So yeah, I do urge you to check out Will's text review for all of the benchmarks across all of the key resolutions. However, what stands out to me from the data is this. The more optimal the game, the higher the frame rates get, the less you'll notice the difference between a top-end processor and a more budget-orientated chip like the 11400F. However, Ashes of the Singularity obviously isn't the only game with a big CPU burden. There are games that are really processor intensive, where frame rates are low, and those can differentiate budget chips from higher end alternatives. But with that said, there are still some very nice results from the 11400F. I want to talk about Flight Simulator 2020, which on its ultra settings here is one of the most demanding CPU heavy games I have ever seen. First of all, pay attention to the frame times. They're all over the place. Any and all processors, even the best of the best, will stutter heavily. Now, Alex's optimized settings cleans some of this up, but it's still a CPU limited mess, and you do need to pay a bit more attention to frame rate here, as it kind of averages out in the moment stutters and gives a broader view of performance. It also helps that it's well below 60 frames per second here. Good news and bad for the 11400F here. Good news is the architectural improvements from the Cypress Cove core ensure you're getting a meaningful boost to performance in this game, especially against the 10600K here. 11600K is about 9% faster in all, but the 11400F essentially ties with Ryzen 5 5600X when averages are taken into account across the entire test sequence. This is a scenario where you can expect overclocks and higher frequencies to make a difference. Looking at the higher end chip comparisons, 11900K is clearly a faster, more fluid experience, though it's fascinating to note that the i5, a $175 processor, can actually beat the Core i9 10900K. Cyberpunk 2077 is another game that perhaps indicates the kind of extreme workloads we can look forward to in the next-gen era. You need a certain level of performance to keep north of 60 frames per second here, and the 11400F kind of sits between its faster brother and the older 10600K, which is closer to Ryzen 5600X performance. Again, you need to go to 11900K for a decent bump to performance at stock clocks at least. I would suspect here that the core overclock on an 11600K could do the job as well. As you can see from the graphs though, price versus performance for this i5 11400F, it really is excellent. We never found the time to comprehensively review the Ryzen 5000 line, or indeed the K-chip Rocket Lake processors, in our videos at least. And to be honest, for gaming I think the 11400F is quite a bit more interesting, simply because the bottom line is that nothing seems to touch this more cost-orientated Intel chip in terms of price versus performance. But I do think it's fair to point out that there are scenarios where Ryzen is unbeatable. CSGO offers simply monstrous AMD performance, where even the fastest 11th gen Intel chip is thrashed by Ryzen 5000. I talked about percentage differentials not meaning much at high frame rates, but it's clear that CSGO simply runs a ton better on Ryzen. Plus 40% more performance is not to be sniffed at, right? Whether we're talking about Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 9, Hitman 3 also shows that AMD can certainly perform. But now I want to shift gears for a moment. You see, pairing a CPU with a 2080 Ti and running at 1080p resolution does show differences in performance, but I wouldn't call it representative of the kind of balance we typically see hardware-wise in a gaming PC. However, if we increase resolution to 1440p, the GPU becomes more of a limiting factor in performance and perhaps brings us closer to the kind of balance we want from a gaming computer. So I'm not going to make things easy for the 11400F in these tests. We're going to compare it to the absolute best of the best. In Far Cry 5 at 1440p, GPU is the limit, right? And that's represented by pretty consistent frame times, but you'll see occasional stutter there, and that's all down to the CPU. Interestingly, it's Ryzen 9 5900X and 10900K that stutter most, though I would suspect that any chip can exhibit this behavior in various runs. We're kind of on the cusp here between CPU and GPU being the limit. Thing is though, overall experience, it's much the same. Crysis 3, it's a pretty consistent run actually. Minor frame time variances you'd be unlikely to feel in the run of play. There's an interesting dip at the end though, always repeatable. It seems to be a combination of extreme rendering load plus checkpoint saving. At this point, the many-core Intel chips hold up while the 11400F struggles a touch, yet it still manages to beat Ryzen 9 5900X. An interesting experiment here in the fractured jaw level of Black Ops Cold War with ray tracing active. Now curiously, RT is actually disabled on this stage on the console versions, even if you have it enabled. Regardless, again, the GPU is a good leveler here, you might think, but Ryzen 9 and 11900K are consistently ahead, albeit by very small single-digit percentage leads for the most part. CSGO, faster clocks still allow the i9s to move ahead of the i5 at 1440p, I guess because GPU load is still minimum at this resolution. But yeah, the 5900X is still in a class of its own. Looking at Cyberpunk 2077, while this is a CPU-heavy game, it's also a monster for the GPU too. So the 2080 Ti at 1440p becomes the limiting factor here, and even in a stress test scenario designed to put the CPU through the grinder, a $175 locked i5 CPU works pretty much the same as a $540 i9. But yeah, there will still be stress points in any given game that a benchmark simply can't anticipate. And in those scenarios, the faster your CPU overall, the less chance of a performance dip and the more chance of a more generally stable experience. So the theme of this video has kind of been that the 11400F is a price versus performance winner. Core overclocks are nice, but unfettered access to faster RAM goes a long way to the point where it's difficult to get a better deal anywhere else. And there is some evidence here that's quite intriguing. Seems to me that the IPC advantages of the Cypress Cove core combined with the extra performance provided by fast RAM can throw up some fascinating comparison results. So here, in 3 games, we're seeing that the i5 11400F here is able to match a stock Core i9 10900K paired with slower memory, which I think is quite a remarkable state of affairs. We were kind of expecting AMD to release a non-X Ryzen 5 5600 to hit this price point, just as it did with the Ryzen 5 3600, and yet, well, months later, we're still waiting for it. In the meantime, the 11400F is unparalleled in its price point, I'd say. The only competition would be the old Ryzen 5 3600. I've got benches of the mostly identical 3600X here, and Intel is faster. If you look at the single-thread dominant Far Cry 5, even locked to 65 watts, 38% faster. Crysis 3 is more Ryzen friendly in terms of core utilization, yet it's Intel with a 10-point lead overall. If we look at the ashes of the Singularity CPU benchmark, it's another Intel win with a 17% point lead overall. But look, this is all looking perhaps too good to be true. So while my colleague Will Judd did the benchmarks for this one, I had to check it out for myself. So look, these are the BIOS settings that I used for my own testing, right? And just to be clear, I am using the boxed Intel cooler here with a 65 watt limit. I did recheck the ashes of the Singularity CPU benchmark results here, and they're exactly the same as Will's. So I decided to up the ante. Now Doom Eternal has perhaps one of the greatest multi-threaded engines. In this test, I'm using an RTX 2080 Ti at ultra nightmare settings. However, I'm running the output resolution at 1280 by 720, 720p, and internally I've set it to 50% resolution scale. That's 50% on both axes. So effectively here, we're looking at a 360p presentation. What this does is to shift the bottleneck entirely away from the GPU and to move it to the CPU. So I'm using the Riva Tuner statistics overlay here, and you can see 3 important things. First of all, at the bottom there's the frame rate, which is just insanely high. Secondly, there's the core utilization. Each and every core and thread is represented there, and you can see just how high the utilization is across the board there. Not 100%, but you know, one core can reach around 90%. Now, the temperatures here, again, stressing that this is the Intel box cooler here, I didn't see anything rise above 70 degrees. Usually it's around 67. And that's a remarkable result, an incredible amount of performance here, and all that we're using to cool it is a rather unsubstantial Intel cooler. It didn't matter how long I played, and I ended up playing for about an hour in total. That temperature limit just doesn't seem to be exceeded. So those are the positives. The negatives, well, that fan does spin up rather loudly. But the point is that it's entirely usable out of the box. Obviously, the noise level is a little bit inconvenient. So there are plenty of inexpensive aftermarket solutions you could look into. But yeah, this is what I would call an extreme workout for the 11400F here. And it comes through with flying colors. All of which poses serious questions to the end user. Intel has an exceptionally strong product here, but it's strong for gaming, with weaknesses elsewhere. Now, if you want a productivity-based upgrade path, the best you can do is an 11900K or 10900K. AMD offers 5900X and 5950X, anything up to 16 cores. And of course, there's the last gen equivalents. So the 11400F is a winner for sure, but its upgradability options going into the future are more limited, especially if you want to do something more than just gaming. In the here and now though, this is a pretty awesome product for gaming. Just make sure you research your board and your RAM to ensure you're able to get full memory bandwidth, and well, then I'd say that you're pretty much good to go. But that's all from me for now, so please do like, subscribe, and indeed share if you enjoyed the content. And of course, for those who have subscribed, bell ringing, of course, it's the order of the day, to ensure you get instant notifications whenever we post new content. Oh, and yes, the DF supporter program. Join up, support the team, get early access to videos, exclusive behind the scenes content, DF retro exclusives, Discord access, and much, much more. But that's it, that's the end of the video. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one, if indeed you did, and just generally, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.